Hello and welcome to Talk Time. Now, this week we're going to look at many things of interest to Africans everywhere. We're going to look at the Kwame Nkrumah Chair at the Institute of African Studies and some of the activities, especially the Festival on Intellectualism and Culture, which just ended last week. We would also be taking a look at the land question in Africa, the landless people and their fate. We'll be looking at austerity measures in Africa, either imposed by the World Bank and the IMF or whoever. Welcome to Talk Time this week. Welcome.
How much is this?
600.
Wonderful. I think I'll take this one.
But what's your size?
44.
This is 43. I could get you 44. This is the man, your home of quality shoes from the UK. We have various shoes for the office, for your formal and casual occasions. Visit the man in Abilingpe. Our office is located just behind Aquatech. Our telephone numbers are 020-873-7166. You can also reach us on our landline 0302-730-760. We'll be expecting you.
Well, hello and welcome back to Talk Time. And this week, as I indicated, we're talking about many things. We're talking about the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana, precisely the Kwame Nkrumah Chair, which is occupied by Professor Campbell, and some of the things that they have done. We'll be talking about the land question in Africa. We'll be talking about the structural adjustment program linked to the neoliberalism and many other things. And we are particularly privileged to be talking to Professor Wazir Mohamed. And Professor Wazir Mohamed was one of the people who participated in this festival of culture and intellectualism at the University of Ghana. Prof, you're welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
What brings you to Ghana at this time?
Well, I was involved in the Pan-African. I'm involved in the struggle of ordinary people, have been for all my life. Was in the trenches at Walter Rodney in Guyana, in fighting for equality and justice in Guyana. I was there when he was killed, and then inherited and became one of the leaders of the movement after he was killed in Guyana. As you know, that he was assassinated in June 1980. And, this is 37 years since he was assassinated. And only last year, a commission of inquiry into his killing was concluded, their report. So over the last 2-3 years, I have been coordinating a justice movement to ensure that justice for Walter Rodney is achieved. Walter Rodney is very important because he represented a generation of new African scholarship and scholar activists who began to excavate the real history of Africa, to bring history to the people and to explain the condition of the people and why the people continue to suffer from exploitation. So, you asked me what brings me to the Pan-African Festival. I've said a mouthful. I was invited to come specifically to talk here about the question of inequality and the growing inequality in relationship to land as people get dispossessed in different parts of the world. So one of the papers I presented at this festival was Walter Rodney's ideas of self-emancipation and what neoliberalism is doing to turn back and to force ordinary people off little smidgets of land that they have occupied for thousands of years, or that came through their family and across generations.
Beyond the intellectual focus of Walter Rodney, what kind of a man was he?
Oh, he was a family man. I mean, he would take his children to school, take them out to music lessons, he'd take them to the cinema. He was an ordinary person. He lived an ordinary life. As you know, he came from a working class household, a working class family, and he never lost that attachment to the ordinary man. So, I mean, he was more in his skin among everyday people, and this is why he developed the idea of groundings with the people. As you know, it is because of his groundings with the Rastafari and the poor community in Jamaica that he was banned from the University of the West Indies and from Jamaica in 1968. That led to the riots in Jamaica in 1968. Apart from that, he grounded with African American communities and marginalized communities in North America and Asia. He grounded with communities right here in Africa, and he was at the University of Tanzania for a spell. And then he went back home to Guyana and was denied a job to teach and head the history department at the University of Guyana in 1974. And he began to ground with bauxite workers who come from mainly the descendants of the enslaved at the African Guyanese community. And then he also grounded with the East Indian community, who are the descendants of indenture. That is where I come out from. And he basically said, that Pan-Africanism in relationship to the Caribbean have to take these different dimensions into consideration. And so, because unless you're bringing working people together, regardless of skin color, regardless of their stations in life, how are we going to achieve the goals of Pan-Africanism, which is developing a society that is humane, that is equal, where people can actually flourish?
What in Walter's work made him so dangerous as to be assassinated?
It's the ideas portrayed in his work. It's the ethos of Walter Rodney. And the ethos of Walter Rodney is basically, look, he gave a lecture in 1978 at Binghamton University where he was doing part-time teaching because he could not get full-time teaching in his own country. And he said to students there and to professors gathered, he said, look, here's the problem that we have. The problem that we have is that history, as it has been written and as it is being taught in our schools today, is history that is written from the standpoint of the ruling class, of those who control the destinies of the people. That the history itself as written is not true. So that's the first point. This is one of the reasons he was killed, because he came with an idea and he said, look, he said, to understand where we need to go, we need to know where we come from. And the challenge for young people, for ordinary students, for everyday students, and I threw out this challenge this week in this Pan-African Festival, is for students to go back and to bring out the real history of the working people. He said the history is was not written from the standpoint of the ordinary man. I went to visit Elmina, and I went to visit Cape Coast Castle, and I saw the fishing villages, and I'm wondering whether I'm 100 years ago, as though things have stood still. I mean, we must remember, and Walter would say that it was here that the technology of preservation of fish, when refrigeration never existed, it was in these communities that the people developed the art of preservation. But yet still these communities are living in poverty. So yes, when he wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, he was talking about these conditions. This is why How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is still a very potent weapon that the people have on their side. Because, Europe Underdeveloped Africa has now gone through its 40th publication, 40th edition. Because it is still important, it's still a necessary work.
How many copies so far?
Huh?
How many copies so far?
I don't know. I mean, it could have been, hundreds of thousands of copies have been sold. It has gone through 40 editions, right? A new edition was just published. But the important thing is the theory within how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Because he's saying, look, we can bleat as much as we want about the slave trade, yeah? But we have to understand that the slave trade was carried out for economic reasons. That Africans were not enslaved because they were black. They were enslaved because they became a product to be sold, to carry out labor. And said the faster we understand things like that, the faster we would understand the money economy and commodification of human beings. So why he was killed and what is in his ethos that caused him to be killed. He gave the working people an opportunity to see their condition through his work, whether it was the history of the Guyanese working people, Groundings with My Brothers, all the lectures he gave, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, the history of the Upper Guinea Coast. Remember, the history of the Upper Guinea Coast was his PhD thesis, which was finished when he was 24 years old. He's an example to every African youth, to every youth of the oppressed in any part of the world, that if Walter Rodney, coming from a working class household in Georgetown, Guyana, can become a doctor, can become such an important intellectual and a figure of work in the world, then any young child can become that. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge. And that is why he was killed. He was killed because he wanted to ensure that people from the bottom up, that power is held from the bottom up and not from the top down. The decision making should be from the bottom up. This is why he organized his politics around the slogan, people's power. Because he believed that it's not leaders who make change, it is people who make change. And it is the people who have to emancipate themselves.
Do we have any idea who organized the assassination of Walter?
Well, I mean, the Commission of Inquiry has just reported. And they have said clearly that the government of Guyana at the time was involved in the assassination. The evidence that came out within the Commission of Inquiry was that the bomb was a remote control, was triggered remotely, and that, the reports came out that it was, who controlled that kind of frequency and stuff like that.
Is there a connection between Walter, his work, and Kwame Nkrumah and his work?
Of course there is a connection.
What is
there is a thread that runs through the works of Walter Rodney, Nyerere, Nkrumah, Cabral, Sankara, Lumumba. The idea was that ordinary people can lift themselves up, that we can create better societies. That's the connection that runs through the works of all these people. That power really should reside, that it is the ordinary people in these societies who should inherit the resources of the societies, that we should have, that every school in every community should have all the resources it needs, so that every child should have equal access to equal opportunity. Sometimes we only talk about equal opportunity. But if there is no equal access, if a child in a village far away from the city center does not have access to broadband, the resources necessary, does not have access to qualified teachers, does not have access to the latest development in science and technology, how will they have equal opportunity? So the thread that runs through from Rodney to Nkrumah to Nyerere to Sankara to Lumumba to Cabral to Morris Bishop is that idea. Is that idea that we need to build a more equal society. in which the people can control their destiny. Today, people are not able to control their destiny. I mean, you know, look at, I mean, in these countries, part of the dream of independence was land reform. Land to the tiller. Because the majority of people in these countries are attached to the land. Today, we're driving down the highway and there are Coca-Cola signs in the middle of the road. So what we're doing is promoting poison. We're promoting poison rather than promoting health. When we have mangoes and papaya and all the kinds of fruits, that we should have fresh fruit drink, that we should have what I call, you see, the West and the institutions of the West promote something called food security. Food security is when you have something to fill your belly. It doesn't matter whether that something is poison or not. We need those leaders like Rodney and Nkrumah and all of them, right, would have been more in favor of food sovereignty, where the people control their own destiny through land, so that you can create healthy living through land. And so when we see the figures about the amount of land in Africa that has been transferred to big corporations, both at home and abroad, through land grabbing over the last 10, 15 years, you have to ask, what are our governments really doing?
Exactly. I mean, Ghana became independent 60 years ago. Mm-hmm. Many African states became independent 50 years ago.
Right.
Are we getting any closer to the dream of our forebears, of a liberated and united Africa?
No, we're going further away. Because what is happening is that the post-colonial world is being recolonized by capital, by the same forces that brought us slavery, that brought us colonization. I mean, how else can we talk about land grabbing if it's not recolonization of land? It's land grabbing turns back all the dreams of the people for land reform, in which people in villages could control their destiny and their food sovereignty, their ability to bring children into the world and to give them something more than their parents give them. Isn't that our dream? Isn't that what independence is supposed to be about? Independence is supposed to be about the flowering of ideas. So that, and what are ideas about? Ideas are about development. We have to give our young people the tools so that they can bring development. When we see, and you know, when I see all these young people when the cars stop on the highways here, the young people are hawking goods in the middle of the road. It shows that we're moving forward and forward away from independence. Those young people should be productively involved. They should be. I was having a chat with the brother on the way here about the need for sporting facilities that allows these young people to be occupied, to be able to grow, to dream, to discuss, to be educated, to have access. So, you know, some people say, well, you know, these countries are in the stranglehold of the IMF and the World Bank. No, we allow this stranglehold to take place because we are not establishing, governments are not establishing compacts with their peoples. Because if the people are united, then the country can negotiate better deals.
Well, viewers, we are talking to Professor Wazir Mohamed, who is a sociologist, but not just an ordinary sociologist. He's actively involved in the struggles of the landless people. He's actively involved in the struggle to bring about equality, social justice, and so on. And interestingly, he used to work with Walter Rodney, and is still pushing the ideas of Walter Rodney. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I'd like to explore something else. He's been talking about food sovereignty. What is food sovereignty? Is there a sovereignty beyond the Declaration of Independence and so on? So that's what we'll be exploring when we come back from the break. Short break.
It's a beautiful day. I'm gonna make most of it. It's a beautiful day, a day to share with you. You'll make my world go round. Yeah, yeah. It's really got me saying, nice girl. Brings home happiness.
Experience the wide range of top quality and affordable electronics, phones, tablets, home and office appliances from NASCO. NASCO, bring home happiness.
Well, hello and welcome back to Talk Time. And we've been talking to Professor Wazir Mohamed, Professor of Sociology, and as I indicated, somebody who worked with Rodney. He's spoken a lot about food sovereignty. He's mentioned food sovereignty several times. Now, Prof, what is food sovereignty?
Well, I mean, food sovereignty, who are the people who produce this food? All ordinary people. There were 2 to 3 billion people in the world who live in the rural communities of the world, who exist on small parcels of land. Some they own, some they rent, some they squat on. But they're the people who have been producing food crops for a very, very long time. What is food sovereignty is that they've been producing these crops. They understand everything about these crops. They have their own seeds. They're producing their own wholesomeness. They're producing the wholesomeness for the communities, and we can go around all the community markets, and it is that food that is there. So food sovereignty have to do with, it comes from the word sovereignty, ownership and control. So what we have to do is to preserve that ownership and control and build on that ownership and control. When I talk about food sovereignty, I mean that we have to invest in the state itself must invest in policies and programs that helps for the survival and expansion of what exists, not the disappearance of what exists. And what we're seeing is companies like Monsanto, big agricultural based companies of the West, are coming in with genetically modified foods, look-alike foods. Foods whose seeds cannot regenerate themselves. Plants cannot regenerate themselves. Foods that does not taste, does not have, is not savoring to the palate. But because they can produce these things in a laboratory, and that you can get more of a same product from less land, it doesn't matter how much chemicals we're pouring into that land. It don't matter to governments anymore how much poison we're putting into the land. We have to realize what will happen 50, 60, 100 years from now. I'm on sabbatical right now, and I went into Guyana in January. And the day after I went in, I was contacted by the World Wildlife Fund. They were going on a tour of the indigenous areas of the country, and they wanted me to come in because a mega farm is being set up in that area of the world, which is the top of the freshwater system. And they wanted me to come in because of my expertise in rice. And so I visited this mega farm with the World Wildlife Fund to advise them. And when I asked questions of what I was told, there is no drainage to begin with. There is only irrigation. So what happens is that they are fertilizing the land, and as they fertilize the land, the fertilizer is concentrated in those spots because there is no drainage. There is only irrigation. So what happens to the poison? It remains there and then seeps. It will seep into the water system. Nobody is concerned. But we have to be concerned, because when we talk about sovereignty, we're not only talking about the sovereignty of the communities, of ownership. We're talking about the sovereignty of birds, of fishes, the sovereignty of the land itself. Are we planning to create more deserts? You know, as land gets irrigated, and I have been a farmer all my life. I mean, being a professor is a recent phenomenon. I've been a farmer all my life. I come from the rural community. In fact, I come from a village of 12 families. And I understand the relationship between land and water. Because once land is drained and irrigated, there is regeneration that takes place over time. What is happening now, as these companies interfere with our food systems, they are disrupting nature and the natural flow of regeneration. And so we know the damage that is being done.
Before we get to the damage, you're talking about African states, Caribbean states, South American states,
Latin American states, yes,
losing their sovereignty over food.
Yeah.
Who are we losing this sovereignty to?
Well, we're losing this sovereignty to multinational companies. We're losing this sovereignty to the subsidiaries of multinational communities, of companies that operate in the local level. Remember, exploitation is always local. Production is local. Yeah? The disappearance is local. So let me give you an example. I have been doing research in the disappearance of small rice farmers in South America. Haiti, which in 1980 was self-sufficient. It was producing enough rice to meet its own internal demand. Now Haiti imports all its rice from the United States. What has happened to those rice farmers? They're now living in worse poverty than before 1980. Honduras had 25,000 rice farmers in 1985. They have about 1,200 today. Because under the Central American Free Trade Act, U.S. rice companies can then send rice as a raw material for processing in Honduras. Mexico, under NAFTA, has lost 30,000 odd rice farmers. My country, with 45,000 small rice farmers in 1970. We have less than 5,000 today.
Is it just about food? Isn't it about everything? Isn't it about our gold? Isn't it about the iron resources? Everything.
It is about all those things. You're right. Yeah. But remember, what we're giving up here are prime agricultural lands, which really should be used for settling everyday folk in the rural areas so that they can regenerate their lives through the land. When we displace them, when these companies come in, whether they're doing mining or whether they're going to come in to plant soy or plant corn, yes, the crops that are needed to produce feeds for livestock, right? Mm-hmm. What is happening is that everyday folk is being displaced. You see, we have to have a holistic discourse about what should constitute development. I mean, I do believe, several years ago I gave an interview to the Interpress Service on this issue. And they asked me about the encroachment of Chinese capital in Latin America. And I said, look, number one, we cannot be against investment, but we have to be in favor of sensible investment. No investor should be allowed to come in to a rural community or any community for that matter and displaces anyone. No investor should come in and displace local small businesses. No investor should come in and displace small farmers. I was in an airport a couple of years ago traveling, and a gentleman was sitting next to me, and he said he was representing a particular government coming into Guyana to get land. I said, what do you want this land for? He said, for dairy production. I said, what are you going to do with the dairy? We're going to set up a cheese factory. And I said, so why do you want the land? Why can't you go into the country, set up your cheese factory, and have the farmers expand their production and supply you, so that everybody benefits, so that everybody have access? You see, we have to begin a discourse about what should constitute development. You see, development is development, all these big monstrosities that are built. And on the side of it are these shanty towns. Are all these people who are displaced from the land and is left to beg on the street. Is that development?
So what can we do to claw back our sovereignty? What can we do to re-establish a sovereignty over our life?
People have to develop what is called people's power. People have to self-organize, because it's only through self-organization we can self-emancipate, as Walter Rodney said, that we have to bring about people's power. But people, these are cliche terms and can be cliche terms. What it means in reality, it means in reality that we have to build consciousness. You see, you asked me the first question about what the connection between Nkrumah and Rodney. The connection between Nkrumah and Rodney and Sankara and Cabral was about building and expanding the consciousness of the people so that the people can intervene in the discourse. Consciousness is absent. Our universities are not doing their work. Our intellectuals are not doing their work. Universities should be the laboratories through which a village, a youngster from a village can come and study and understand what needs to be done, and then go back to that village and implement it, being able to ground with people and organize them so that they can create movements like the Food Network movements, like the movements that are budding movements that can engage in discourse with governments, with the IMF, with the World Bank, so that we can build a stronger civil society.
Prof, you've written a lot about landless people, this new phenomenon of landless people. May I ask, who are the landless people? How do they become landless?
Landless people.
And when you talk about landless people, in relation to what are you talking about landless people?
Well, you have several types of landless people. You have people who have been living in rural areas for generations and never had access to land because of how land is managed and controlled. Right? That is why we needed land reform at the time of independence, so that the people, yes, who needed land to do agriculture, to do different things, can have access. So there are those who never had access to land, who need to have access to land. And then there are those who are displaced, who had some access to land but are displaced. Or, I mean, in the session that I spoke at, in one of the sessions I spoke at this week, a young woman from Burkina Faso asked me a question, and she said, women in Burkina Faso is denied land because they're women. Right? We should not have that level of inequality. And she asked me a direct question: what can we do? Should we fight? I said, yes, you have to fight. You have to organize. You have to organize, and you have to make demands. But we also have to learn from other people. You see, the women and I pointed out to her that the women in Latin America don't have the same goals as the women in the West. Everybody believes that the women's movement is the same wherever we go. It's not true. That the women's movement in South America said that our goal is to have equality. But equality have to do with equal access and ownership to land. So land, they're saying that land should be communal property. Because if land is communal property, right? A man would not own it, and a woman would not own it. Both of them would have equal access and equal share to the land. You have to remember that when, at the beginning of time, in hunter-gatherer society, and we have lived in this world, and sometimes we don't remember, that most of human history, people lived in hunter-gatherer society, where no one owned land, where land was communal property, where there was no discrimination between men and women. We don't remember these things, but it is historians like Walter Rodney who have come and who has pointed out this history, who have given us a pathway so that we can push the door open to learn and rekindle this history. And so to address the question of those who are dispossessed, this is what belongs in the classroom. This is what we should be teaching in every school.
Now, Prof, is there a connection between this phenomena of landlessness and the surge of neoliberalism across the world? Is there a connection?
Oh yes, I mean, the neoliberalism is the extension of the neo-colonial ethos, because remember, after colonialism ended in these countries, Ghana in 1957, Guyana in 1966, Zimbabwe, these countries developed an ethos that was named by the UN as the development period, where they were beginning to find a non-capitalist path to development, where they were beginning to help communities organize cooperatives. What can we do with the land? Some countries, you had little small agricultural banks that people could access small capital and small loans. All of that began to disappear as structure with the crisis of the 1980s and the structural adjustment programs that were imposed on these countries. These countries were told that if you want access to capital, then what you have to do is liberalize. You have to devalue your currency. You have to denationalize. You have to privatize the commons. So areas that were owned by the government should then sell it out to private concerns. That is the neoliberal ethos at work. But the neoliberal ethos is more than that. It's more than that. I mean, look at all these big supermarket chains that are coming into the country. Why do we need these big supermarkets? Look at what the big supermarket chains are doing to the community shops. As the big supermarkets come in, what happens to the man or the family that had a little small business? As all these snack foods enter the marketplace that are produced someplace else, what happens to the family in a community that was producing snacks and selling in front of the school? All of that disappears. So a whole system disappears. A whole system in which the people were involved. So what neoliberalism does, it reshapes the society and creates this major division between the poor, enlarges the number of people who can now fall in the poverty bracket, right? And creates a small group of people at the top who have more money than they will ever be able to spend in many, many lifetimes. You know, and you see that driving to this studio. I was pointing out to the driver, in the midst of this concrete jungle, you have little people living in these little hovels on the roadside. That's what neoliberalism has produced. And we can go from India to Mexico to Rio to Kampala to Accra to Nairobi, and we're seeing the same dimension. We're seeing the same dimension. Because what has happened is that governments have been forced, because governments are weak, because governments have not created unity in their own country so that the country could move as one in confronting these issues that are global, so that they can have a better negotiating position.
Prof, we've spoken about neoliberalism, we've spoken about food sovereignty, we've spoken about landless people, and so on. Who and what is creating this new dispensation? What are the forces at play? And what are the forces that can bring about change?
The forces at play are what we're seeing is that, we talk about global capital. And I asked the question this week. I said, is there something like called global capital? Because capital is local. Capital does its mischief in every local community. And because capital exists and does its mischief in every local community, it is then left to us in the local community, wherever we exist, to confront capital. And to confront capital, we have to organize. We have to be conscious. We have to create institutions. Every village council.
Are we not dealing with the same forces that were responsible for the transatlantic slave trade? The same forces that were responsible for classical colonialism, and the same forces that are responsible for new colonialism. Has something changed?
Yeah, many things have changed. Yes, we're dealing with the same forces. Yeah.
So what has changed?
We're dealing with what has changed is that the world has become closer to each other. Communication technology has just revolutionized. We have the internet. So the internet has now allowed capital to move as freely as it wants, wherever it wants. But what has happened is that our governments and our governmental systems, our human capacity has not improved. We have not used the same technology to improve our relations with each other. So we have all these restrictions on travel. So we still have people being arrested at the airports for entering some country illegally. What is illegal? What is an illegal immigrant? Aren't we all human beings? If capital can inherit the world in the way it can, why can't we as human beings inherit the world and be free? And that's you see, we have to have this discourse.
Do we really have our governments, the governments, for example, in Africa, governments of the people? Are they our governments, or they act in the same way that the colonial governments?
I would leave that question for the people of Africa to come in on. What I would say is that most governments are really the managers of the neoliberal system.
And therefore they act on behalf of capital.
Yes, they act. The governments and governmental machinery is fashioned to act on behalf of capital, what capital wants in every dimension. So every government in the third world have national budgets, for instance. But what are these national budgets? These national budgets are designed, if there's a problem of street children, you then bring in a consultant. You pay them millions of dollars to come and study. We understand what the problem is. Let us find a solution to the problem. Yes? If there's street children, let us develop institutions in the country. right? To go out, to be able to feed these children, clothe them, educate them, so that they can sprout. It's like pouring water on a plant, right? The plants are dying.
We need to give them.
We need to give that plant nourishment.
Yeah.
But governments are not giving those plants nourishment, because governments are being managed by the IMF and the World Bank, and they're not. It's not that it's a stranglehold. The governments allow themselves to be strangled.
Well, viewers, this is Talk Time, and we are talking to Professor Wazir Mohamed from Guyana. That doesn't make a lot of difference, but he is from Guyana and has just participated in the Cultural Intellectual Festival, which is organized by the Kwame Nkrumah Chair at the University of Ghana. We're going to go on a short break, and when we come back, I'd like to find out what the concrete situation in Guyana is today. What is happening in Guyana? And if we have enough time, we will possibly look at the legacy of Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, not just for Africa, but for the world. Short break.
Bibiara wa melkom Luciano le melkom Nofiano ye melkom. What are you looking for? Melkom got it all. Great discounts, no door. Yamafia so. Best bargains on our days. Everything here is a bargain. High quality must be a priority. So tell your mom, tell Poppy, tell your actually everybody. Bibiara wa Malcolm.
Well, hello and welcome back to Talk Time, and we are in conversation with Professor Wazir Mohamed. As I said, from Guyana. He's worked with Walter Rodney. He's here for a festival organized by the Kwame Nkrumah Chair at the Institute of African Studies. Now, Prof, what is the situation in Guyana right now? What does Guyana look like? What is happening in Guyana?
Guyana is a fledgling democracy. As you know, that for a number of years, Guyana did not have free elections. Walter Rodney was a martyr in that process in fighting for free elections. We had the first free elections in 1992. And so what you have is a coalition government operating in Guyana. And basically, I mean, the struggle is how you produce change. I myself have done a stint recently in the Ministry of Education to help, because, you know, I think that it is important. It's always important for us, from wherever we come from, to be able to transfer our knowledge and technology to the communities that requires change. Guyana, like any other country in Africa, requires change. That change can only come about, as I said, if bottom-up programs are implemented to bring about that change. I see this conference and this movement in that light, because this movement is about bringing consciousness. Why do I say that? I mean, let us.
Before you get there,
Yeah.
I mean, there are some terms that are used, and sometimes they're more confusing than enlightening.
Right.
One of them is free elections. You know, I mean, Aung Suu Kyi has just been elected in an election that is described as free and fair elections, and yet there's no dictator in the world that is more brutal than Aung San Suu Kyi.
Well, it depends on how you.
Ouattara in La Côte d'Ivoire supposedly was elected in a free and fair election. So, what is the thing called free and fair election?
Well, I mean,
free to who and fair to who?
These societies are fractured societies, and that's what we have to understand. Guyana have a division, a racial division between people like myself and the descendants of the enslaved. And so there is always that tension, yeah, in that situation. Walter Rodney felt that to address the question of development, that those two groups have to come together and see eye to eye. That's one of the reasons he was killed, because it was a potent idea. Up to now, we still have to struggle for that, to reach that point. So when we talk about free elections, it means winner take all, who gets the majority. It does not mean that who gets the majority will bring about the change, because that majority may be based on the majority group, or the majority group at that moment in the society. And so we have to repair the fracture. We have to repair the fracture where we commit these infractions against each other. You know, a woman from South Africa at the conference asked, where do we go from here? And I said we should go back home and we should build respect among each other. Within Guyana itself, we still have to build respect between these two groups. In these societies, we have to build respect between the different religious groups and different minority groups that exist in the countries. It's a big challenge. It's a big challenge. And this is why education is supposed to be the tool of liberation. Yeah? Education is supposed to be that tool of liberation. But what do we learn? The Caribbean, yeah? Tell me something. I had to fly to New York to get here. The distance between Guyana and Ghana is shorter than the distance between New York and Ghana. I have to fly twice the distance to get here. Why can't the Ghanaian government and the Guyana government, why can't the African governments and the Caribbean governments get together in a summit and say, how are we going to bridge the communication gap? Well, how are we going to have direct shipping lines, direct airlines? You see, the development of the Pan-African world calls for will.
Prof, at the beginning, you demonstrated that the real division in society is between the marginalized, the poor, the disadvantaged, and so on, and the filthy rich.
The small group.
And so on. Now, this theater for contest, multi-party democracy, free and fair election, and so on, is it a theater for that contest of the classes? A theater for the contest between the poor, the marginalized, and so on, the dispossessed, and the powerful. Is that the theater?
It depends on that. It would depends on the ability of the working people to organize and to be able to seize the initiative within that sphere, and so develop a path for change within that process. I mean, we have had different paths to change. In Grenada, Maurice Bishop and the New Jewel movement overthrew the Geary government in 1980. Violent. I mean, nobody was killed, but it was they had some guns and they overrun some police stations and stuff like that, and they began to build people's power from the ground up. And then the implosion took place. So we had gone through that. Yeah, the Surinamese seized power in 1980 also. The Nicaraguans seized power around in the same period. The Iranians seized power in the same period. In each theater, it depends on the ability of the people to organize. To seize the space.
In Guyana, have the working people managed to seize the space? Are the working people really developing the consciousness, the organizational ability and so on to confront the state?
I can't tell you that there is any place in the world right now where the working people is able to develop the consciousness to seize that space. Guyana is no different. Guyana is no different. Because they, and it depends, I mean, you know, what has happened over the last, I mean, I think we have to recover from the onslaught of neoliberalism. Because you remember what neoliberalism did was gutted the working people's institutions of their best brains and turned most of our leaders into NGOs. You know, everybody became a leader of an NGO. Yeah? And they were, all these guys, all these people from different political parties and different movements overnight were transformed. They were flying, living in the air. They're moving from conferences to conferences. And I always ask myself, when do they have time? Would they ever have time to deal with the interests of the ordinary man?
They were never meant to have time.
We have, and this is the kind of analysis that we have to engage in. Yeah? I have never joined an NGO because I saw what they were from the beginning. Yeah, some of them are doing some good work. Yes, and we can't take away from some of the work that NGOs do. But in the main, this fiction has sucked away the consciousness, the leadership that existed in the 70s and in the 80s from among the working people, and made them into in a different form of elite.
Prof, isn't it possible that leadership of the 70s and 80s was not a real leadership? These were petty bourgeois elements seeking to profit from the struggles of the working people.
I don't think so. I don't think that yes, many of them were petty bourgeois elements, but to claim that they sought to benefit from the backs of the working people is a stretch. Yeah, because remember, there was the 70s, the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s were periods of real people's upheaval. And so those leaders, people were able to hold those leaders' foot to the fire. Yeah? We don't have those upheavals anymore. Those upheavals based on consciousness, based on what the people think they needed from the ground up. What we need are ground up movements. We need a new cadre of leadership who can develop ground up, and they're not going to come from among the petty bourgeois. They will have to come from within the communities.
Now, Prof, in a nutshell, what do you think that is the legacy of Kwame Nkrumah?
The legacy of Kwame Nkrumah is the fact that he was able to give Ghana, or people in Ghana and the wider African community, including the Caribbean, because he was also a hero in the Caribbean, is this idea that we can be independent, that we can think independently, that we can act independently, that we can develop economic independence. You see, political independence is one thing where we change leaders. Yeah? But leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, their legacy is that they showed us a path forward, that we can develop the consciousness. If we are able to develop the consciousness, yes, then we can have economic independence. That it is within our reach. But we have to reach for it. To reach for it, we have to become conscious.
What do you think the impact of this festival that you just attended would have on the struggles of ordinary people, you know, across the third world?
Well, I think it depends on the extent to which people are paying attention. It depends to the extent to which we go out there and continue to have these kinds of discourses and enlarge these discourses. But I'll tell you what I was heartened by at the conference was the level of consciousness, a new kind of consciousness that I have not seen for a long time among young people from different parts of the continent. For me, that gave me hope that we have a future, that our people, that we can fight for a future. And that for me was important. And you know, I see a young man here from Nigeria, yeah, but there were young people from Nigeria, Burkina Faso and different parts of the continent who question why is it we have to drink Coca-Cola? Why we're not drinking fruit drink? So when you young people in this digital age are making those summations about their condition, it means that the legacy of Rodney, of Nkrumah, Sankara, and Cabral is living, that these people lives in the population.
How would the outcome of this conference be owned by the people who can make the change, can and will make the change? I'm talking about the working class, the landless people, the people out there in the streets who are unemployed and so on. How would this festival impact on their struggles?
Well, I mean, we must first ask the question: how will the festival impact the University of Ghana itself?
The University of Ghana is not a place for the dispossessed, the landless, and so on.
But it's a place where the dispossessed should be able to come and be educated.
Are they able to go there?
Those are the questions. Those are the issues that we have to grapple with. Why the landless doesn't have equal access to come and be educated, so that they can go back and they can create the change. Because why do we get education? Do we get education to leave these communities? Or do we get education to help these communities develop? You see? And so this is a challenge for the university itself. And it's a challenge for all of us as intellectuals on how we're going to... I mean, one of the things that I said last night on Ghana television is that what we need are not more intellectuals. We need more activist intellectuals. We need more intellectuals who are not hobnobbing and drinking coffee with each other, but hobnobbing with the ordinary people and grounding with them and teaching them, taking the university to the communities.
Or learning from them.
Or learning from them. We have to learn from the working people. And that's, look, it's a...
But how do we ensure that what is taught in the university has relevance to everyday life? How do we ensure, for example, you make the point...
That is where people like me come in.
You make the point that history, as is taught in educational institutions, is not our history.
That's where people like me come in.
It's the history of capital. It's the history of the slave traders and so on. How do we make what is taught in the university relevant to the lives of our people?
Well, we have to make it relevant.
How?
I mean, in what we teach, in our curriculum, in how we develop our classes. Yeah? Mm-hmm. I mean, this experience, for instance, I mean, I've been to the two slave castles here. I've been to the last bath in Asif Mansour. How do I translate that experience to the classroom? Yes? In another theater becomes important. You see, it's bringing the knowledge to the classroom in a continuous way. That is why, for me, this is a learning process. How do I translate what I see on the streets here in Ghana? Yes? For people in Ghana to understand that their condition are no different. You see? That was the message that Kwame Nkrumah brought, that Walter Rodney brought to the working people. That your condition are no different from the working people in any other place. Yeah? Mm-hmm. It's only that you live in two different places and you don't know that. But you know, we have television, we have the internet, we have social media now. You have a role, and you're playing an important role here. Right? So. in sharing this information. Mm-hmm. Because it is through this kind of information that the communities that are dispossessed is able to see that there are other people who are also dispossessed and are fighting, and to learn from what they're doing.
Now the world is getting more and more interesting. Mm-hmm. United States of America has elected Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. The Philippines has elected Duterte. Mm-hmm. Macron has emerged in France, and Theresa May is the Prime Minister of Britain. Mm-hmm. Are we getting closer to the goal of liberation?
The goal of liberation, what we're seeing is the way in which everyday folk, the dispossessed in every community, whether we're talking about North America, whether we're talking about the Philippines, can now recognize the problem. We're seeing that in all across the globe, in every theater. Yeah? So the possibilities for people to unite are now becoming very, very clear to communities. Yeah? So yes, yes. I wish I could answer your question in a different way.
Yeah, but thank you very much for coming to.
Thank you for having me.
Very, very much. Well, viewers, we've been talking to Professor Wazir Mohamed, originally from Guyana, but is a citizen of the world, and he participated in the conference on intellectualism and organized by the Institute of African Studies, the Kwame Nkrumah Chair, the Institute of African Studies. I hope that this conversation has enabled all of us to learn a thing or two, or to unlearn a thing or two. Please stay with Pan-African Television, because this is where we bring you the best in Africa, on Africa, about Africa. This is where we show you all the documentaries on the national liberation struggle in Africa, the struggles of the people in Latin America. This is where we show you documentaries on our lives as underprivileged people throughout the world. And this is where we provide analysis to the problems that confront us. Please stay with us. Let's work together and create a better Africa. It's goodbye from all of us at Pan-African Television. The producer, director, Joseph Yevu, the cameraman, the makeup artist, everybody who brought this program to you. See you again next week. Bye-bye.